Public housing was established by the federal government in 1937 to provide decent and safe rental housing for low-income families and individuals. In the beginning, many put hope in the public housing system to solve serious lack of affordable housing across the United States. However, racial issues, mismanagement, crime, and violence over the years have devastated the public housing system. Today, we ask the question, what can be done?
The history behind how the public housing got created in Richmond, and in particular the displacement of African American neighborhoods, especially in Jackson Ward, by large-scale highway projects and urban renewal efforts. They really almost deliberately created these segregated ghettos, would be the right word to use in this case.
Richmond had racial zoning, that areas of the city would be zoned exclusively for blacks or exclusively for whites. Now, this was later challenged in the Supreme Court. The law was overturned, but segregation just rolled merrily along. So you had race-based zoning, you had restrictive covenants, you had redlining. You also had policy that restricted public housing strictly to the city and to one part of the city. All of the public housing in the city of Richmond was placed in African American neighborhoods. These laws, these practices led to a highly segregated city, still very much segregated. And even though the laws are off the books, the effects of that segregation still haunt us. However, African Americans who could not afford to buy a house were forced into public housing. And that's when you begin to see that the public housing, particularly in East End Richmond, became overwhelmingly African American. They didn't want to go to public housing, but they really had no choice. And so the black community increasingly was split along social lines.
Blackwell was a public housing community built in 1970 in Southside Richmond. It quickly deteriorated due to its poverty-stricken and crime-plagued surroundings. The Hope 6 program was created to revitalize Blackwell, focusing on building up mixed-income communities rather than isolating poverty. However, the community was ultimately destroyed by poor planning and execution, and the word Blackwell became synonymous with failure.
Well, Blackwell was redeveloped under some federal funds. It was a program, it is a program known as Hope 6. The idea was to redevelop public housing, to go to mixed income. What happened was that a really depressed area of South Richmond, high crime area, was redeveloped, and many of the residents of the Blackwell public housing were displaced. They were not able, some were able after new housing was built, some were able to go back. But most of the housing was moderate income. Some was market rate income housing. And so a lot of the tenants were displaced. And so what happened is you simply displaced poverty from one section of the city to another section of the city.
Jackson Ward is a historically black neighborhood in Richmond. Once a thriving cultural and economic center, crime, poverty, and construction have torn it apart.
Jackson Ward was the center of black life. There were other black neighborhoods, but it was the largest African American neighborhood in the city of Richmond. By the 1920s, Jackson Ward was very large. About 90% of all African Americans actually lived in Jackson Ward. It was to Richmond, Virginia, as Harlem was to New York City. It also had a very strong business sector. In fact, Jackson Ward was often also called the Wall Street of Black America. Jackson Ward was what today we'd call a mixed income community, which means that people of different incomes lived in close proximity.
In the late 1950s, Interstate 95 was constructed through the center of Jackson Ward. This dividing force halted the social and economic growth of the once thriving community.
Well, it basically just ripped Jackson Ward in half. It went right through the middle of Jackson Ward. It displaced 7,000 African Americans, constituting at that time about 10% of the black population. That was in 1956.
Interstate 95 isolates Gilpin Court into an area of highly concentrated poverty and crime. Combined with its age of almost 70 years, these factors have driven Gilpin into a state of disrepair. It is vital that redevelopment plans are made carefully to prevent another Blackwell.
I think it is irresponsible to go forward with it because they're talking about, I can't remember the exact number now, but it's a pretty substantial reduction in the number of housing units that's going to be available for low-income public housing. At the same time, they're trying to increase the density of the area, so it's going to be creating a mixed-income neighborhood, which is sort of the standard goal these days.
The idea is to go to mixed use, which is not just residential, but commercial development. Also perhaps have a school there, as well as some stores and shops, places where people work and where people live.
They need to come up with a plan about how they're going to rehouse everybody, given that not everybody's going back to Gilpin Court. Establishing that the right way to redevelop an area is not to throw out the people who are there now and put in middle-class people in their place. That may look good aesthetically. It may look good in terms of having nice photos to put in the community development brochure of the city. It might even help the tax base, but it's not really helping the people